Well, welcome everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I'm professor of political science and international affairs here at the Elliott School of International Affairs in the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies at George Washington University, and also co-director of PONAR's Eurasia, the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia. And I'm very happy on behalf of my colleagues to welcome you to this panel on Ukrainian perspectives on current US-Russia crisis. We have heard a lot of voices on the crisis, and it struck us that one that we have not often heard has been the perspective of Ukrainian scholars. We've heard Ukrainian people on the street, Ukrainian government officials, lots of American voices, lots of Russian voices. But what we wanted to do here was to present to you a variety of leading voices from Ukraine's own experts on not only politics in Ukraine, but also Russia-Ukrainian relations and broader concepts that they research as part of their careers. So the speakers today will be Volodymyr Dubovyk from Odessa's Mechnikov National University, Sergiy Kudelia from Baylor University, Tetyana Malyarenko from the National University Odessa Law Academy, Olexiy Haran of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation and Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and Oksana Shevel from Tufts University. And again, just before we go, I will note that the program is sponsored here by PONAR's Eurasia and by IRIS, the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and its Petrach program on Ukraine at the Elliott School of International Affairs here at GW. And so I want to thank everybody for that. We've asked each speaker to lead off with about 8 minutes of comments to keep it fairly short. We anticipate lively discussion, so encourage you to present your comments for the guests' reaction and also to present questions you might have for them in the chat. As moderator, I will relay questions from the chat to the speakers. So just as they're speaking, please feel free to pose your questions. And I look forward to what should be a really stimulating discussion with a interesting diversity of viewpoints. So we'll just go in the order in which people are listed in the program. So our first speaker will be Volodymyr Dubovyk from Odessa's Mechnikov National University.
Oh, thank you, Henry. Thank you for giving us a voice, Ukrainian scholars on the subject, and I appreciate it very much so. Well, what is going on? And that's a question that's on our minds for a long time now, and for weeks, and if not months. And let's try to decipher, even though there is no clarity. Even yet, after many, many weeks of guessing, very intensive analysis and over-analysis, still we are not quite sure what's going on. It is definitely a crisis. It's not really Ukraine crisis, but much broader crisis. It's just over Ukraine, a crisis over Ukraine, perhaps. Or as the title of this panel suggests, US, Ukraine, Russia, but you can throw Belarus there, you can throw NATO in there. So there are many players, many facets, and many aspects of the crisis. Basically, there are two ways of explaining what Russia is doing. The one is that they're preparing for invasion. And in that case, of course, it's also very important to try to understand what kind of invasion, where, when, and under what circumstances, and is there a way to actually prevent that from happening? Or is it a big, very credible, very costly, very systemically organized intimidation game? Because what we've seen in the recent weeks or even months actually, falls under both of those scenarios, and we can't tell. We can't quite tell. It is something that's been timing of it has also been puzzling. Like, why now? Why all of a sudden this sense of urgency in Moscow rhetorics and their statements? Why they think that this needed to be decided right away? There are many explanations here, starting from perhaps something going on in Kremlin with Siloviki, with hawks taking upper hand and moderates being sidelined. Something going on here in Ukraine, obviously, when Zelensky was seen for a while by Putin as a worthy counterpart and maybe a softie, with whom Putin can actually achieve something over Ukraine, but that proved not to be the case. And in fact, Zelensky has done a number of things, including taking a bunch of pro-Russian TV stations off the air and actually putting under house arrest Mr. Medvedchuk, who is Putin's top man in Ukraine. That's one of the reasons, of course, because I've seen an article in Time the other day, I think yesterday, where the author was actually suggesting that probably a major reason behind what Putin is doing, but I don't think he is avenging his friend Viktor Medvedchuk. I think it's much broader than that. It probably also has something to do with Ukraine NATO cooperation, which is really going forward, in a turbo speed, and that troubles Russia. And they actually say it out loud that even without Ukraine being a member of NATO, we are already seeing such a tremendous, kind of unprecedented amount and extent of cooperation that we're worried that Ukraine would be de facto member even without having a membership if that pace continues. And then also perhaps there is something was happening in Black Sea. I don't know, with presence of NATO battleships here, with spy planes, NATO and American planes flying over Ukraine, with strategic bombers flying not too far from Russian borders. Something here as well. What tipped Putin over this red line that he maintained this crazy intensity and urgency? We don't know yet. But what we're seeing is, of course, is very alarming. And what really interests us, of course, is there enough of rationality left in Kremlin? Because Putin was primarily known always as a rational player, someone who is a shrewd and cool tactician. But is he still that player? Or is he someone who got passionate, emotional, who became an ideologue with his pronouncements and his articles about Ukrainians and Russians being part of one people and so on? Is he really trying to commemorate the 30th anniversary of dissolution of Soviet Union and the 100th anniversary of creation of Soviet Union by some moves that are designed to bring certain parts of lost territory back to Russia? We don't know, but we will probably see on our Ukrainian side, what we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot of hybrid threats as well. With a threat of explicit invasion, we still also suffer through a lot of hybrid threats. There are many calls about schools being mined, and that's not just sporadic episodes. We're having hundreds of calls in major Ukrainian cities about high schools being mined and they have to be evacuated. There've been major cyber attack that put down the websites of Ukraine's ministries and agencies. There have been many other things. Embassies, of course, started evacuating, few, not too many, but some. The airlines cut some of their overnight stays here in Kyiv and elsewhere in Ukraine. So it's been kind of a tense situation here, but also there is, I believe, there is some kind of disconnect in terms of how Ukrainians see it, Ukrainian leadership and Americans do. And you've noticed the other day, the press conference by Mr. Zelensky, when he downplayed the threat. And the next day, there was a Security Council meeting, and the Russian representative there at the United Nations has actually quoted Zelensky on saying that America is instigating the whole hoopla and intensity, and Ukraine doesn't see a real threat. There are many reasons and attempts to explain what's going on, what are the reasons for the gap. One is that Zelensky actually saw a lot of these escalations before, including one in the spring of last year. Another one that we got used to it with a huge, amount of Russian troops next to our borders. But also the economy, they say he tries to prevent panic, and because we're already seeing major capital flight from Ukraine in recent weeks. But also, I'm afraid there is a certain lack of trust between Washington and Kyiv these days, which is troubling me, because it's exactly a situation where our position should be watertight. And yet there is probably a lack of trust. And that goes back to 2019, when Zelensky was only starting to be president and he faced Trump's blackmail. And that's when he learned that Americans might actually be playing some tricks and games. And there is a popular conspiracy theory. And I'm afraid probably Zelensky believes it himself, that United States have some kind of a game in mind, trying to scare Ukrainians into some concessions, vis-a-vis Russians. I don't see any evidence of that, but that's a widespread notion here in Ukraine. And before I conclude, to give the floor to the other speakers on our panel, I would like to say that on our Ukrainian side also, it's very important that we have this resilience in place, and we're trying. We're doing our best. Of course, in some places there is more nerves now and more tension than in others. For instance, President Zelensky, for some reason, mentioned Kharkiv, just figured it out that Russians might take, he said. Or, for instance, we know that Odessa, with its geostrategic location and significance to Russia, is also one of the probable directions for assault if assault actually takes place. It's also very important for the united message coming from Ukrainian leadership, because one day we have someone who is in charge of National Defense and Security Council saying we are out of Minsk, and the next day the office of president says no, we're actually not out of Minsk. So I don't think that's helpful on part of Ukraine, and I think it's also the PR moment is lacking. There is not much of work that government does with the population, preparing for whatever comes, what different eventualities that might happen in the coming weeks and months. There is not much work being done. Maybe on some city levels, like in Kyiv, Mayor Klitschko does more of that, but here in Odessa, for instance, I don't see any preparations for any troubles, for any attack, let alone attack, but any difficulties. And most finally, I'd like to offer the opinion that on the subject that some people say that Putin got himself up so high in a tree that he couldn't climb down now. I don't think so. I think that first of all, for domestic consumption, he would easily present himself as the winner. But for international audience, he is also he might present himself as a leader of a country which grabbed attention for many months now. It's a major show of force. It's a don't mess with us message, which is working. They really miss the Cold War, and now they are many steps closer to this Cold War because they really needed this kind of limelight that they had for 40 or 45 years of the Cold War. And if he de-escalates, he'll be a hero. I mean, he'll be a peace hero. He'll be deserving a Nobel Peace Prize. So I think that Putin would definitely, if he chooses to de-escalate, he would find certain trophies that he can show to domestic audience and also to the people around the world that he's achieved through this crisis. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Volodya. Our next speaker is Sergiy Kudelia of Baylor University.
All right, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Marlene, for organizing the panel. I'm glad to be part of it. And we've heard from multiple speakers already the discussion of the current crisis in the context of Russia, of Putin's motives, of his imperial ambitions, of his goals and relations with the West. And this is a valid approach because obviously Putin is the only or the key decision maker in Russia. So it's reasonable to focus on him, but this tells only part of the story. And in my remarks, I want to focus on the other part of the story, and that is on Ukraine. And let me primarily say or formulate my thesis, and that is that the rising tensions on Russian-Ukrainian border are symptomatic of a breakdown of diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict in Donbass. Why is Donbass central to understanding the current crisis? Well, let me suggest two main reasons. Well, first, for Russia, the Minsk agreements offered the solution not only for settling the conflict, but also for addressing broader security concerns associated with Ukraine's push for NATO membership. And we've heard over the last weeks from Russian diplomats multiple expressions of concern about the possibility of Ukraine being drawn into NATO or in closer cooperation, military cooperation with the West. Now, how would Minsk agreement resolve this? Well, one of the elements of the Minsk agreement is the autonomy for parts of Donbass. And that autonomous status would give Donbass a stronger say over Ukraine's policy choices, including foreign policy. And this would, in fact, require Ukraine to adopt neutrality or risk a renewed armed conflict within its borders. Now, there is already a significant demand, popular demand for a neutral status within Ukraine. Over 40%, according to the latest surveys, actually would support neutrality for Ukraine. And bringing the rest of Donbass in would only make this support overwhelming. Hence, as long as Moscow saw any prospects of implementing Minsk, it was willing to abstain from seeking other non-diplomatic means of preventing Ukraine's NATO membership. Secondly, over the last 8 years, these two self-proclaimed republics in Donbass turned into de facto enclaves of Russia. Over 500,000 people who live there received Russian citizenship, which obviously gives Moscow a formal pretext to openly defend the region in case there is a military pushback from Ukraine. At the same time, we understand that there is a low-intensity military conflict that continues and has continued for the last 8 years in the region, We see daily ceasefire violations. We see daily killing or weekly killing of military personnel. Some civilians are being killed as well. We see violations of the prior agreements to withdraw troops. And in fact, the heavy military equipment is positioned on both sides of the contact line. All of this creates favorable conditions for the military escalation at any point. If full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine begins, it would be triggered by the intensified violence in Donbass and justified by the need to protect Russia's citizens there. Now, how did Ukraine's diplomatic posture on Donbass change under Zelensky? And Volodymyr just alluded to one of these changes, and that is an inherently contradictory position of the Ukrainian authorities with regard to the Minsk agreements. In public statements to the international audiences, the Ukrainian authorities declare their commitment to the fulfillment of the Minsk agreements. For example, just following the recent meeting of the Normandy 4 advisors last week, in their joint declaration, they said that the Minsk agreements are the basis of the work of the Normandy format. At the same time, in communication to the domestic audience, Ukrainian officials dismiss Minsk agreements as unworkable and dangerous. For example, already this week, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Olexiy Danilov, stated that the fulfillment of Minsk agreements would mean the destruction of the country. These mutually exclusive statements send a very clear and strong signal to Moscow that Ukraine no longer takes the diplomatic track of conflict resolution in Donbass seriously. Moscow is then faced with two choices: either allow itself to be duped or take action to bring Ukraine back to a negotiation table. As we've seen in the case of Ilovaisk or Debaltseve, the most compelling response from Russia's standpoint could only be military in nature. Secondly, Zelensky's position on several key issues with regard to Donbass has become even less flexible and more hardline than that of Poroshenko. For example, Zelensky dismisses the possibility of direct talks with separatist leaders, which is the only mechanism for reaching an agreement on the exact terms of the settlement. Zelensky dismisses the possibility of an amnesty for separatist leaders and their supporters, which is the only way to resolve security dilemma they would the state summit and demobilization. Zelensky rejects any possibility of giving parts of Donbass an autonomous status, which is the main condition, in fact, for Donbass to become reintegrated. So Zelensky's transformation that happened over the last several months from a peacemaker to a hardliner could only be understood in the domestic political context. Since winning office, he has been under pressure from the nationalist right-wing forces, suspicious of his pro-Russian sympathies. This made Zelensky realize early on that any conciliatory moves in talks on Donbass could be used as a pretext for another Maidan revolution or for his removal. As a result, Zelensky now finds that a continued deadlock over Donbass is much more advantageous for him politically than any diplomatic breakthroughs that could come for him at a very high price. So the Kremlin's strategy of raising tensions on Ukrainian border represents an attempt to raise the external costs of further diplomatic deadlock and an attempt to change Zelensky's political calculations. Even the threat of the Russian invasion, as we've seen in the last weeks, imposes significant economic costs on Ukraine. Ukrainian currency has depreciated. Ukrainian foreign bonds have been in the downward slide. The crisis is also quite damaging politically for Zelensky. Just several months ago, the survey showed that Ukrainians no longer viewed Donbass conflict as the issue of primary concern. Instead, they were concerned with corruption, inflation, rising utility prices, so economic issues. But now, Donbass is back, and the sense of insecurity is rising among Ukrainians. And with it, the understanding that Zelensky cannot implement one of the key promises of his electoral campaign. For the East, it represents a betrayal of trust. For the West, for the Western Ukraine, it represents a sign of weakness, because only weak leadership could make Russian aggression possible. Zelensky's performance as military leader is also not quite compelling. Altogether, only a third of Ukrainians thought that Zelensky could be a capable commander-in-chief. And Ukrainians preferred Poroshenko to Zelensky in the role of a commander-in-chief by a ratio of 3-to-1. This is further reflected in the overall popularity rankings. Recent opinion polls put Poroshenko's party ahead of Zelensky's party in parliamentary race, with Poroshenko and Zelensky actually now tied in the presidential opinion polls. These economic and political costs may be one of the main reasons for the attempt by the Ukrainian authorities to downplay the likelihood of the Russian invasion. But ignoring the threat, actually, we understand, would not make it go away. There needs to be an open recognition of the fundamental drivers behind the tensions and a serious effort to address them. So let me leave you with three main takeaways. First, the threat of Russian invasion is meant to raise the costs of diplomatic deadlock over Donbass. Second, the only way the Western leaders can dampen tensions without making direct concessions to Putin is by influencing Ukraine's diplomatic posture on Minsk agreements. And third, a change in Ukraine's diplomatic posture needs to be followed by substantive steps in Minsk implementation. Otherwise, we are going to see the escalatory dynamics renewed again. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Sergiy. Our next speaker is Tetyana Malyarenko of National University Odessa Law Academy.
Thank you very much. I would also like to continue a topic on Ukraine reaction on the crisis. And also the President Zelensky told us that the war will not happen. It's very useful to analyze the reaction of Ukrainian society, economy, and leadership on the crisis and predict how they will react in the case of real war. According to the calculation made by Office of President Zelensky, Ukrainian economy lost about $12 billion during this month of information war around Russian aggression, and Ukraine lost access to foreign borrowing markets. But already in February and March, Ukraine must pay about $3 billion on its foreign and domestic debts. In general, over the last years of Ukrainian hybrid war against Russia, Ukrainian economy lost about 150 billion. It's about 20% of Ukrainian GDP, and has not yet reached its position of 2013. Generally, what is the most dangerous in economy that Ukraine seems to be is entered the cycle of never-ending war with Russia, that Ukrainian government told that we have to prepare that the conflict and hybrid war on maybe some escalation open conflict will take place for long years. But at the same time, Ukrainian economy cemented its resource cycle. So today, the export of resources, mostly agricultural products and natural resources, is the major position of Ukrainian export. And China, Russia, and the European Union are the major Ukrainian trade partners. And the roles of China is cementing. And this year, China update its historical record to be the first Ukrainian trade partner with $70 billion. And again, Ukraine also depends on money transfer from Ukrainian labor migrants who work abroad. And this year, again, this Assam updated his historical record. It's about $15 billion. So the situation is that the country has to export resources and increase military spending. But more important, however, is that there is no understanding in Ukraine what kind of war will wage Ukraine against Russia, and the statement of Ukrainian authorities and direction of reform, defense reform, they propose, they change almost every day, and they contradict to each other. So the statement, there is no general line what we will do and what kind of war we expect to wage. And the first Ukrainian strategy of military strategy, it stated that Ukraine is not going to reach military parity with Russia. Again, in the line of escalation of current crisis, Ukraine adopted the doctrine of military national resistance, according to which all population, both men and women, have to be mobilized to military service. But today, the number of armed forces in Ukraine, it's about 260,000 troops, and National Guard is 52,000, and the Border Guard, National Border Guard troops, 53,000, and potentially additional 120,000 policemen who train to do some military exercise can be mobilized in the army. In total, today we have about half of million, 530,000 military personnel. And the military spending increased every year from 1.6 billion in 2013 to about 5 billion in 2022. However, these funds are mostly paid from salaries and social guarantees for personnel, 80%, and only 20% for military equipment. So in fact, we have large army land forces who are not very good paid because average salary is between $300 US per month to $1,000 for soldiers who serve at the front line in eastern Ukraine, and not very surprisingly then that young people do not want to join Ukrainian army. Ukrainian army enjoy very high level of public trust among population, but as a employer is not so popular. However, a few days ago, following the reaction of Ukrainian society and Western partner, President Zelensky signed a decree which recommends to increase the size of Ukrainian army on another 100,000 troops, and one more 130,000 troops will be recruited according to the law on territorial self-defense. More dangerous from the point of view economy, I would say that there's a lot of troops, 130,000 will be found from local budgets of Ukraine, but local budgets already finance education and healthcare. So it will be huge pressure on local budget. So if reform proposed by Zelensky will be implemented in the nearest future, we will have about 700,000 troops of Ukrainian army, again, not very well paid and not very well trained. And as Minister of Defense Reznikov said, he is ready to mobilize about 2 million of reservists, civilian people, to armed force, and plan to organize a 3-month training for them to prepare them to meet Russian army on the border. Of course, it sounds like black humor, but it's a little bit remind the picture of Second World War when a weakly trained civilian population met a German high-tech army on the border. So what should be done? I will be short. First, that Ukrainian military doctrine should be revised, and it should take into account the hybrid character of war. I was always surprised why we wrote hundreds of articles about the Russia hybrid war doctrine, but now we are preparing to this Second World War style military invasion with hundreds of tanks and millions of troops. So Russian military doctrine is a doctrine of symmetric war, high-tech war, in which private military forces, psychological operations, cyber attacks took serious place, and Ukraine should decide for itself and should do the economic task to calculate limited resources, how they should be spent for different priorities, what kind of army we need, what kind of threat we will likely meet, and how our economy and society should react on this situation. And second, but also very important, it's economic dimension, economic development and democracy. For many Russian speakers and ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine, Ukraine is a choice because it's perspective and its commitment to European values of human rights and democracy. But if Ukraine demonstrates the big state institutions and corruptions and poverty and poor financial management and weak human rights protection, for majority of people, for Russian speakers, for ethnic Russian, of course, it will not be reason to support Russian work in Ukraine, but it will be less people who would like to protect such a state.
Hey, thank you very much, Tetyana. Our next speaker is Olexiy Haran, who represents the Democratic Initiatives Foundation and the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Do we have Olexiy?
I was so thrilled to hear all others that I muted myself totally. Okay, so I prepared a presentation based on the poll of Democratic Initiative Foundation, which was the polling was ended on December 22nd, but now there are newer polls. But basically, they confirm our main results. And actually, I am very thankful to Sergiy Kudelia, who nicely summarized Russian viewpoint, why the crisis is happening. So I am actually happy to demonstrate how Ukrainian population view it, and because Ukraine is democracy, so we may find people with different views, definitely. So the points of Sergiy were that Russia is to rebuff NATO expansion, to prevent military push up from Ukraine, to persuade Ukrainian government to fulfill Minsk agreements, which Ukrainian government doesn't want to fulfill, and also to provide special status for the occupied territories and full amnesty to the militants, which Ukraine doesn't want. By the way, Ukraine, well, so let me just demonstrate what we have. Okay, so this is the blue line. Okay, the blue line is support to NATO. This is just a moment. Oh, sorry. This is dramatic turn in 2014, and then you see the support of basically because of Russian reaction, because Russia attacked non-bloc Ukraine. So when Russia is saying, okay, let's have Ukraine as non-bloc status, we had non-bloc status. Nevertheless, it didn't prevent us from aggression. So, and then you see ups and downs in support of NATO, but not huge actually. The support is basically quite stable, and ups and downs may be explained by the periods of tension and some search of compromises. So now we see the increasing of support for joining NATO because of Russian concentration on Ukrainian border. So basically, when Russia is saying, you know, NATO don't expand to Ukraine, it's so dangerous for Ukrainian, the more Russia has this drum beating, the more is support for NATO in Ukraine. Now, regarding Zelensky and his comparison with Poroshenko and other things. So first of all, Zelensky, as we know, he was elected as a pacifist. He believed in compromises with Putin. His idea was very simple: we sit down and talk and we will solve the issue. Poroshenko didn't want to solve the issue. I'm ready to solve it. And what we received, Zelensky made very serious steps towards Putin, including the so-called Steinmeier formula, withdrawal of troops and other things. And did we reach a ceasefire? No, Putin continued to shell Ukrainians, not only Ukrainian soldiers, but also Ukrainian civilians. Again, it's not in the interest of Ukrainian government to start a military offensive in Donbass. This simply would be crazy. Ukrainians, by the way, doesn't support it. Ukrainians believe in compromises, but not at all costs. So if we are talking, for example, about amnesty, Ukrainians are not ready to give amnesty to the leaders of the separatists, but basically to combatants, rank and file. Yeah, this is possible. You know, Ukrainians do not seek lustration for those people who are involved in so-called state structures of the so-called people's republics at the middle and lower level, only about so-called ministries and presidents and other leaders of the so-called so-called People's Republic. So basically, Zelensky tried, Putin continued his approach. As a result, the number of those who believe that Russia has started a war in Donbass, you see, increased under Zelensky. Still, we have about, how much? It's about 16% of those who believe that were Ukrainian government and oligarchs which started war in Ukraine. Yes, we have those people. Again, we are democracy, we have freedoms, we have TV, and by the way, we have the presence of the opposition, pro-Russian opposition on TV. It is continued. So now you see the next slide. Again, between different interpretations, is it aggression of Russia assisted by local militants, or it's a civil war, domestic conflict? Basically, red line, you see the decline, which happened just in 1 year. Just in 1 year, again, because of Russia is doing. Now, this is about potential concessions from Ukraine, how many Ukrainians supported, but let me show you perhaps one of the main issues. This is CAGL, this is translation, clumsy translation of Ordlo into English. So certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which is official formulation in Minsk agreements. Now you see how many Ukrainians think that that these territories should be returned to Ukraine in the status that was before 2014. You see basically that this is not less than 54%. Now, how many people believe that these territories should get autonomy from Ukraine? You see 13%. Basically, the figure is stable. So this is not about, yes, this provision of Minsk agreements is not popular at all. Can we say that Ukraine denounces Minsk agreements? No, because if we read Minsk agreements according to their logic, not in Russian interpretation, there is number one. Number one is ceasefire. Number two is withdrawal of heavy weapons, exchange of prisoners, and so on and so forth. And only then there are political issues. So basically, we cannot move towards political issues which are really, divisive without implementing security provisions. But there's no ceasefire in Ukraine since 2014. Again, it's easy to reach if there is a will of Putin. I'm quoting Mr. Hug, a Swiss national from OSCE, who was saying, yes, if you see the clashes, again, you see the periods when the clashes are high, and you see zero violations of Minsk agreements, which means it's very easy to implement ceasefire. If there is a political will, there is a ceasefire. And again, for Ukrainians, we prefer peace. Why? Because we are democracy, because all our victims, they are on television. So it's not beneficial for us to lose people, for any Ukrainian government. While for Putin, it's just a cannon fodder. It's not on television how many people in Donbass are killed on Russian television, how many militants are killed, and how many Russians are killed. And finally, let me present you. There is a partial ban on some Russian channels, not all. We still have Russian channels in Ukraine in Russian, but this is the attitude towards the ban of some Russian showbiz and movies. And you see definitely the trend. So red line against the ban and green line is in favor of the ban. So the trends are visible. The difference is about 10%, but the trends are visible. Finally, Western reaction. By the way, Ukrainians are strongly against direct talks with Putin. More than 50% of Ukrainians are against direct talks with Putin, but to talk to Putin in the presence of international mediators regarding direct negotiations with the leaders of militants. This is not Zelensky's invention. It was traditional approach to of Ukrainian democracy. Again, they are not independent players at all. They are not independent actors at all. It's not even like in Abkhazia or Transnistria, you know, fully controlled by Russia, criminals and militants. Finally, the Western reaction is belated. We are thankful to what we hear now for what is done. But the only thing which may stop Putin is the strength of Ukrainian army. So we have belated supply of arms to Ukraine and sanctions. And only now, after 8 years of the war, the West is talking about potential personal sanctions against Putin. And what is important for us is that because there is a possibility of the so-called limited military operation, it's very important recent American statement that any incursion of Russian troops would be considered as an aggression. And by the way, there is a sweeping annexation of creeping annexation. I'm sorry, my English is not so good. I'm from older generations. So a creeping annexation of the Azov Sea by Russia, and we don't see any expansion of sanctions. Finally, we see a lot of people who call us to understand Putin concerns. We have a lot from the left-leaning intellectuals and from the left forces in Europe. For me, it was always a surprise because I originally, in my youth, I was very left-leaned, and I know what are the basics of the left ideology. This is international support, solidarity, defending victims and defending democracy, not dictators and aggression. And in this, I just wanted to have a very, very short test in this audience. Do you know what was the reason for creation of the first international? And I am stopping here. Do you know the reason? Henry, what was the reason to create the first international?
Well, I think we need to move on right at the moment. So
okay, so I will answer. And the reason for that was solidarity of workers with Polish uprising against Russian tsarism in 1864, 63, 64. So I urge I put this question actually to the shadow cabinet ministers of the Labour Party. They didn't know.
Yeah, sorry, Olexiy, we need to move on to the next speaker.
Please, yeah, but just remember that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Our final speaker is Oksana Shevel of Tufts University.
Thank you, Henry, for organizing the panel and for inviting me to take part. Sort of the advantage of going last that you can kind of engage with some of the things that we already said, but of course, many things that I wanted to mention were already well put by other speakers. So let me try to pick up on a few things and make a few points. So I would begin by saying that I think one of the issues that make the current crisis very difficult to solve, that we essentially having, and even to think about, we're essentially having several interlocking pieces. We essentially have three interlocking crises of US-Russian relations, NATO-Russia relations, Ukraine-Russia relations, and it's hard to say, and there are conflicting opinions out there, how to prioritize among these issues, what is really driving, like what maybe is the main one, or if simultaneous progress is possible. So I think it is actually very helpful and important to think of what's going in and around Ukraine as far as having these three simultaneously moving pieces: Ukrainian domestic political dynamics, realities in public opinion, and elite preferences, Putin's, Russia's, or really Putin's ultimate cost-benefit calculation, and really the main goals. And then Western response to different moves by Russia and how that in turn might change the calculus. So I think all of these three things work together. So I'm going to try to primarily focus on the Ukrainian and to some extent Russian rationale there. And then, if there is time, we can also talk about the Western response. So I'll start with the overall Russian goal. And I think that really is important to keep in mind what is really Russia trying to achieve. And I think we should take Putin at his word that he does see Ukrainians and Russian as essentially one people. Ukraine is denied agency, and essentially Putin wants to limit Ukraine's sovereignty. So it is about NATO, but it's not only about NATO. I think it goes more to geopolitical orientation of Ukraine and Ukraine's potential departure from Russian so-called sphere of influence. I think we saw this, that it's not just about NATO, going back to 2013, as Olexiy already mentioned, when aggression started. Following Euromaidan, Ukraine was not a member of NATO, it was a neutral country. NATO was not even on the agenda. Yanukovych was negotiating association and free trade agreements with the EU, and even that was unacceptable to Putin. So we had the trade war starting already in the fall, and then of course, annexation of Crimea and instigation of insurgency in Donbass after the victory of Euromaidan, right? So I want to sort of circle a little bit back to what Sergiy was saying, because I totally agree with him that I think Minsk could be seen as a potential solution, quote unquote, right? In other words, for Russia, if it could achieve its objective of limiting Ukraine's sovereignty through Ukraine agreeing to Russian interpretation of Minsk, especially the special status that would give de facto veto power to the separatist territories and the proxy leaders that Russia has installed there over Ukrainian domestic and foreign policy, like that does accomplish Putin's objective. But I think it is also important to keep Minsk in this sort of broader context in mind. So Minsk is not just a settlement of some Ukrainian domestic dispute that certain territories gets autonomy or, you know, greater say in domestic affairs. It is really, and this is how it's perceived in Ukraine. And I think this is why we have seen essentially a stall on the Minsk implementation to Russia's liking, since, you know, after these agreements were signed in the conditions that, of course, were not advantageous to Ukraine, right? That it would essentially give Russia the same outcome, right? That it could potentially achieve through military invasion, occupation, overthrow of the government, and have the West to agree, right, that Ukraine rightfully belongs in the Russian sphere of influence, right? So yes, Minsk could be the tool, you know, the objective, or rather the way for Putin to accomplish what he seeks, right? But there is this broader context and, you know, potentially normative and foreign policy and all other questions. Is this unacceptable for one country to essentially do what it may to bring another country into its sphere of influence, right, through these methods? So I would say just a couple of more things on Ukrainian domestic political realities and this likelihood of a full-scale invasion. There has been this disagreement, right, openly, when US was saying that invasion is imminent, and Zelensky is saying, you know, don't overestimate it and create potentially, you know, basically don't talk about it as imminent. I think that actually makes sense, because I think Ukrainian domestic political realities are such that any invasion, attempted occupation, and essentially attempt by Putin to achieve what he seeks, which is control over Ukraine's foreign policy in particular, but even broader kind of orientation, I think would be incredibly difficult to achieve by force. I hope Putin realizes this. Of course, we don't know. And I think what it goes to these dramatic changes in Ukrainian public opinion that Olexiy was illustrating with his slides. The irony of it, of course, is that Russia had so much leverage over Ukraine up until 2013. There was this reliably kind of Russia-friendly electorate in the East and the South. There were a lot of elites in Ukraine who had all sorts of, you know, economic and other dealings with Russia. Russia had influence over the media. And none of these levers, I would argue, disappeared after Yanukovych fell. So had Russia not annexed Crimea, it's more likely than not that, say, in 2019, you know, even if pro-Western, you know, Poroshenko government could have been replaced by even more pro-Russian president than Zelensky. And we had this sort of alternation of Ukrainian presidents through the 1990s. A pro-Russian leader would get elected, invariably disappoint the electorate, then, you know, a more pro-Western one would get elected in turn, and then that would alternate. I think that would have continued, but of course, you know, we are now looking at a very different domestic political landscape. The rise in support for NATO, the decline in support for any kind of Russia-led union, and then, you know, over 50% of the population who are saying that they would resist any kind of Russian occupation and attempted control of the country, many of them militarily. These numbers are also quite actually high. There is regional difference, but they're also substantial in the East and the South. Now, this is not to say that these numbers are somehow like give us exact percent of people who would resist, but it does make, I would argue, any kind of attempt of overthrow of Zelensky government and installation of some kind of pro-Russian puppet government that would then do Putin's bidding very, very unrealistic. This government would have zero legitimacy. no domestic actor, institution, group, or public would support it. So really the only way this government could rule is through the force of Russian arms behind it, which would mean sustained occupation, right? And this is why I think, even for Putin's calculus, this is not a preferred scenario, right? If he could achieve what he wants through Ukraine agreeing to his reading of the Minsk agreement, that would probably satisfy him, right? So I will just add by saying maybe just a couple of words on the Putin's kind of cost-benefit calculation. We, of course, don't know what's in Putin's head, and unfortunately, what Russia does seems to pretty much depend on what Putin thinks. But a few things I would mention. I mean, one, it seems like it's actually quite worrying that Putin almost lives in his own bubble or preferred reality when it comes to Ukraine. There is consistent denial, and he openly denied it, for example, at the latest Valdai meeting, that this change in public opinion that Oleksiy was illustrating is somehow real. The narrative that seems to be constructed is that these preferences are falsified, either because people don't really believe, don't really say what they believe, or they're hiding their true pro-Russian preferences. So this whole idea that Ukrainians and Russians are somehow one people, so these opinions, are either coerced somehow, or people are basically afraid. I mean, Putin says that much. So he essentially dismisses, not only the public opinion as it now stands, but also Russia's obviously impact on this change in public opinion. I think that creates quite dangerous alternative reality and really raises the question to what extent is Putin a rational actor. We don't really know who he gets his information from. I was on the panel with a few Russia experts a few days ago, and one of them suggested this interesting idea that not only the decision-making circle is very small, but now with COVID, even fewer people have access to Putin. So he may be getting sort of, information along the lines that, these Ukrainian preferences are not really real preferences, and if Russia were to be there militarily, they would be welcomed on the streets and so forth, right? I mean, again, I'm not saying that's the case, but it's something, to think about. So finally, I would just add on the point, just to say something about the Western response. I think there is really a dilemma for Putin between going small and going big, right? In other words, if he goes small, sort of more cyber attacks, maybe even there has been some talk about formally recognizing annexation, like formally annexing the territories of LNR and DNR, or maybe even going a little bit, I don't know, capturing Tetyana village or something, right? And then there may be muffled Western response to this. Yes, he can maybe get away with it, right? But it doesn't really achieve his ultimate objective, which again seems to be certainly have say over Ukrainian geopolitical course and foreign policy decisions and ultimately sovereignty, right? But then, of course, if you move big to try to achieve these objectives, not only it would be incredibly costly, as I said, it would require, I think, outright occupation of the country for a substantial period of time with substantial number of force, right? It also, there is no longer plausible deniability. And if the Western sanctions and condemnation and potentially Russian ostracism in the international arena is there, then again, he doesn't accomplish his objective, because not only he wants to control Ukraine, I think he wants West to recognize this as the new normal, right? So I think, again, here it's very important how the West would respond. Maybe we'll get to talk about it in the Q&A, but I think looking at these three pieces simultaneously, Ukrainian domestic political process, preferences, and changing these preferences that Oleksiy talked about, Putin's ultimate objective, and different ways to get at it, including through the Minsk process that Sergiy talked about it. And then how, how the West response, right, might actually change Putin's calculation, which in turn could also influence the likelihood of further aggressive action. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Oksana. That's great. There's so much interesting food for thought here. We already have a good number of questions that have come to me in the chat. What I'm going to propose is that I pose one question from the chat to each of the speakers, and then we'll turn to each of the speakers, and I'd ask them to address the question that they've gotten, plus any one other question that they would especially like to comment on, or if they would like to respond to anything that the other speakers have said. But if you could keep the comments brief, ideally 3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes each, then we'll still have time for a good second round. So the question for Volodymyr Dubovyk comes from Pascal Siegel, and that is basically, what would be the economic implications of a long-term Russian campaign of intimidation? For Sergiy, I'll actually give him a couple here because he got a few questions in the chat. One is from Sarah Whitmore, which asks, and she asks whether you, Sergiy, could substantiate your claim about Zelensky coming under pressure from nationalist forces. Like, what do you mean? And there's a related question from Ben Didomichis who asks about like where do you see any such renewed Maidan like you talked about against Zelensky coming from, and whether that might be supported by the West. For Tetyana, I'd pose kind of a general question which comes up at least implicit in a number of the questions we've gotten, which is what are the prospects for reconciliation between the self-declared Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, the Ordlo, the occupied regions, and Kiev. For Oleksiy, maybe you could address this question from Natalia Savalyova, who asks what Ukrainian people think about whether they're ready to fight. Are ordinary Ukrainians ready to take arms should Russia move in militarily, or they prefer to keep neutral? And finally, for Oksana, there's a question from Yaroslav Pilahinsky, who asks about to what extent internal crisis within Russia might be driving Putin's actions. So let's just go back in the order that we began. And again, just remind people, please try to be very brief so we have time for a good second round. Volodya, the floor is yours.
Sure. A great question about the economic implications of a long-term Russian intimidation. Well, first of all, the Russian intimidation has been ongoing for years now, since 2014. So this is just a new phase, a new stage, a new level that we're seeing. But one of the reasons they're doing what they're doing in Donbass is to make Ukraine bleed and be destabilized and lose money. A war effort costs money, obviously. People trying to invest into Ukraine will think twice whether they want to invest in a country where there is a de facto war ongoing, even though low intensity doesn't matter. So it's been ongoing, but now they're probably seeing that Ukraine is still standing on its 2 feet and actually registering some modest growth, economic growth. And that's, of course, not okay if you want to strangle Ukraine, and they're putting their game on a new level. So they are already tried blockading Azov ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol, as you know. They've already tried, the Crimea is taken away, obviously. So now there is a talk about the blockade of the Black Sea coast as one of the measures that might try, without even putting any troops on Ukrainian soil in the new places. They might blockade ports of Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and that would be another devastating blow to Ukrainian economy. And the whole scare, which is ongoing and just increasing, the crescendo of this panic, of this hysteria, is already costing us tons of money. So it's a hard situation economically, but one thing is good for us is that to offset all these losses, we're getting this amazing, massive support from international community, particular countries, groupings of countries. For instance, the Prime Minister Johnson was here the other day. A revelation, the global Britain is really, interestingly enough and surprisingly for us, is working as a major ally of Ukraine these days. So they're offering something like 2 million pounds, 2 billion pounds, of course, to support Ukraine, infrastructure and energy sector. There's been support from European Commission. There is a new fund of 5 countries, US, UK, and Canada, and Switzerland, and Sweden, with a major supply of funding for Ukrainian needs as well. So that's interesting because some of the things that Putin has produced with regard of this intimidation is that Ukraine is now flushing in the money all of a sudden, losing the money, but also getting a lot of financial support, close to what we always wanted to have, a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. That is basically what we're having right now, even without invasion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sergiy.
Yes, thanks for the questions. So Zelensky actually is an interesting populist figure that manages to maintain contact with his voters, with his supporters through direct appeals, through video, TikTok, etc., but who did not manage to develop organizational capacity to mobilize his supporters on the streets. His political party, the Servant of the People, is losing support. It is a virtual party. It really does not have any physical serious presence in the regions. And those political forces that do have a mobilizational advantage are the political forces that are associated with the far right or nationalist forces like Poroshenko's European Solidarity, the Azov group, the National Corps, Svoboda Party, etc. And I would just refer you to my Ponar's memo, which I published 2 years ago, which is called Veto on War, Veto on Peace, where I describe the dynamics that led Zelensky to basically give up on some of his early promises for reconciliation under the pressure of a series of rallies that were held under the slogan "No to Capitulation." In 2019, in the fall, and then in 2020, right before COVID, some of the largest rallies that happened in Kyiv and in other cities of Ukraine were held, organized by some of the same forces that organized Euromaidan revolution, including Petro Poroshenko was an active participant, of course, in those. And in these rallies, there were direct threats to Zelensky that if he makes good on some of the promises regarding, for example, the implementation of Steinmeier formula, he would be removed from office and there would be a third Maidan. And after that, we've seen that despite his earlier promises, he gave up on the promise regarding Steinmeier formula. And the Steinmeier formula is not implemented. It is not part of the Ukrainian law and still. He also gave up on other promises that he made while he was in the first months of his presidency regarding the direct negotiations, for example, amnesty and the autonomous status. All of this was reversed, and partially, one can argue partially that was why Putin, following the Normandy format, when he saw that Zelensky is not willing to follow up on his earlier promises, was no longer willing to organize any direct talks or meetings with him in that format with two other foreign leaders. Nationalist forces are still very strong, and you know that there is a open criminal case against Petro Poroshenko. And we've seen that right after the Poroshenko's return to Ukraine, there have been relatively large demonstrations in his support, and his political party is capable of mobilizing their supporters from different regions of Ukraine. When he returned to Ukraine, I was in Western Ukraine, in Lviv, and many of my colleagues and family members were telling me that they were receiving requests or invitations from the Poroshenko party to come to Kyiv and participate in these kinds of rallies. So the nationalist forces still have a strong mobilizational advantage, and they are a serious constraint on Zelensky's actions. Also, I wanted to briefly talk about the findings that Oleksiy shared with us regarding the popular public opinion, and I certainly agree that the majority of Ukrainians are very skeptical about the implementation of the Minsk agreements and reject many provisions of the Minsk agreements. And yes, it is a problem politically for Zelensky, and yes, it is one of the reasons why he is reluctant to move ahead with the implementation of Minsk. But we know from multiple other examples of countries that experience armed conflicts that these types of talks, negotiations, are very costly politically, are unpopular. You can look at the example of Spain and the talks with ETA, that were highly unpopular and hence were kept in secret. You can look at Colombia and see that the agreement with FARC was highly unpopular among Colombians and was actually rejected at the referendum. But the fact that these types of agreements are unpopular is not the reason not to try or seek to implement or negotiate on the terms of these agreements. And in fact, I would welcome if Oleksiy believes that Ukraine is a democracy, even though all political scientists know that Ukraine is not a democracy. It is at best a partial democracy. And if you look at the Freedom House rating, Ukraine was never ranked as a democracy. It is a partial democracy. Some can argue it's a competitive autocracy, a hybrid regime. It's not a full democracy. But if you believe that you support democratic dialogue and exchange of ideas, I think it would be great if we debated the benefits and the merits of the Minsk agreements in public on television. But unfortunately, these kinds of debates are not happening on the Ukrainian television because people who argue in favor of the Minsk agreements would be immediately branded as Russian stooges and traitors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sergiy. So Tetyana is next.
Yes, it's On your question about local attitude in Donetsk and Lugansk, of course, I don't have opinion pool to illustrate my position, but I can speak on behalf of my friends and relatives who live there. I would say that for this 8 years of their isolation, they accept the status quo and more realize individual strategies of adaptations to realities. So they apply for Russian citizenship, they try to accommodate themselves to find job in Russia on a local market, and the less and less they perceive Ukraine as their home country. And even in talk, they more speak about Ukraine as a foreign country, just say, let us alone, we don't want to return to Ukraine. I think this situation will continue in the future. And sometimes I'm very surprised that I'm originally from Donetsk, I have to say, maybe someone don't know. I'm surprised that too much attention is paid to Minsk agreement and Minsk talk. For me, it's more and more useless, both as Russia leverage on Ukraine. Olexiy demonstrate public attitude to Minsk agreement and public attitude to possible reintegration of these territories. And it's less and less useful for Ukrainians themselves. Both population in Donetsk and Lugansk, majority of whom has a Russian passport or in the process of application on Russian passport, and territory destroyed by armed conflict. So I believe that in the next few years, the Minsk talks will be less and less important in both in Ukrainian and Russian politics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tetyana. So Olexiy Haran is next. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Regarding polls and regarding just a moment, I was listening to my colleagues and I lost. Where can I demonstrate? Share screen. Okay, share screen. Share screen. Sorry, somehow I'm lost because but I will tell you. I will tell you that I've sent an web link to our research. It's in Ukrainian. It's much broader than I presented to you. It's also with regional breakdown, so you may see the differences, but you may see that basically even in the East and South, there is a plurality in support of general all Ukrainian trend, definitely with regional differences. So it's in Ukrainian. Somebody asked me about access to English language slide. I'm ready to send it. So just send the general mail from Ponors to where I may send it, and I will resend it to you. Regarding attitudes to war, yes, we had our polls, our own polls, and the other polls, they were mentioned. Yes, plurality of Ukrainians would be ready to fight. Another portion will support army by other means, meaning money, volunteering work, donor blood, how to say it, being a donor of a blood for wounded, and so on and so forth. Some people will choose the strategy, I don't care. So it's, well, my strategy would be of survival. Okay, about 20%, which is also understandable. So this is understandable. Let me elaborate on a thesis actually about direct negotiations with the militants and how it can be done. But first of all, let me say I'm really, striked by, well, not striked by the use of term nationalists. And what do you mean by nationalists if you were talking about it in academic terms? So, to lump in nationalists, center-right Poroshenko party, conservative right Svoboda party, far-right Azov, well, doesn't make you understand what's going on. because you may simply say the patriots, the people who are ready to defend the country, and within them there would be a lot of different ideologies from left to the right, and people of different ethnic origin as well. The examples of Spain and Colombia, is part of Spain occupied by the other country, Sergiy? Is part of Colombia occupied by other country? So again, what we are talking is that Russia would like to represent it as a civic conflict. And if there is a civic conflict, yes, there is necessity to talk. But if it's occupied by the foreign power who just installed the puppets, how could we negotiate? That doesn't mean that we cannot reach a compromise. Again, as I have said, in Minsk agreements, there's no mention about People's Republic, no mention at all. So when we are talking about certain districts, Ardlo, and decentralization, it means for local communities. So basically, if at some point, because I agree with Tanya that it would be very, very difficult, and we see a trend of Russian forceful passportization and the changes, people are isolated from Ukraine. So by the way, I have students from the occupied parts who are speaking Ukrainians. Still, they manage to, to study Ukrainian, but definitely they feel isolated in this region. So basically, there is a possibility to move forward with discussion and even for this region to enjoy decentralization, but not kind of the parliaments or presidents of these so-called republics, but basically decentralization meaning self-government, at the community level. So again, compromises are possible, but in order to reach it, we need to fulfill some security reasons. Zelensky will not be able to talk about political concessions if there's no security, if there are no gains which he can present to the people. Finally, about freedom houses, Sergiy, unfortunately, you are wrong. Because after the Orange Revolution, Ukraine was recognized as a free country. Unfortunately, we didn't survive in this capacity. But, well, not to say that it's democracy. It's very imperfect. It's hybrid regime. We can call it as hybrid regime, but to call it competitive authoritarianism, come on. By the way, today there was a manifestation of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy at the Cabinet of Ministry of Ukraine. We demanded resignation of minister. So, but this is another story, but this is example of civic activism, how people are not silent and how they're ready to put demands and to defend academic freedoms, because basically it was against the intervention of Ministry of Education. Ministry of Education into the electoral process within Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. So today you may see on your TVs how it happened and all the creativeness of students, not only from Kyiv-Mohyla, against the minister. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next is Oksana Shevel.
Thank you, Henry. Let me address the question that was directly posed to me, and then maybe I'll just make one quick comment on the Minsk thing. So the internal crisis is potentially driving Putin's strategies in Ukraine. The short answer is I don't think so, because I think it is very uncertain that Putin stands something to gain domestically if actually there is an escalation in the conflict. There isn't much, even Crimea was very different, but this sort of like massive support or anything resembling massive support for some kind of armed military action against Ukraine is not really popular from what we see in the Russian polls. It can only become more unpopular if actually intervention were to happen and like dead bodies begin to come home. Kind of what is the casus belli, like for what purpose is that exactly being done? And then I think if we sort of keep going down that line of thinking, I mean, if say there are massive sanctions on the Russian oligarchs that they're not able to access their properties and so forth in Western countries, right? Like we may also begin to speculate that there may be erosion of an elite support, right? So I think if anything, Russian domestic domestic context may be one of the breaks, right, that exist on Putin's sort of thinking, right, and potential action in Ukraine. So that's what I would say for the on the Russian angle, domestic politics angle. And let me just very quickly comment on this discussion we've been having about kind of compromises, implementation in Ukraine, like if Zelensky, wanted to compromise and was prevented. I think sort of the unfortunate dynamic there is that the more Russia, the more aggressively Russia pushes against Ukraine, right? And the more sort of the goal is really control of the country, right? Like the veto of country's sovereign decision making, the less likely any president, for that matter, would be to compromise on this. So in a way, like any sort of, yes, Minsk already stalled, and I think if now to reopen these negotiations and concede on this fundamental, cross what Ukraine considers red lines, which is essentially the special status that would give this region's autonomy, veto over Ukrainian domestic foreign policy, I think it's very unlikely. So it's sort of ironically for Russia, kind of the less aggressive its stance would be, the more likely actually some concrete compromises on amnesty, on potentially, some sort of electoral arrangements, right, on like joint police forces, like all of these things, like the specific bits of the Minsk agreement, I think they would have been more likely, not less likely, to be implemented. So I would just sort of leave it at this, and we can continue discussion if there is more time.
Thank you very much. We have a set of questions now that I'll group in the following way. One on the West, one on this issue of what's driving Russia, and then another one on how Ukrainians, kind of the Ukrainian political establishment is reacting. So what I would do is just to offer in the final 10 minutes we have each speaker up to 2 minutes to respond to any of these that you would like, but hopefully we can make sure we get all of the questions covered, and to make any final concluding remarks that you might want to make. So the question on the West is from Martin, and it is about how do you assess the level of unity of Western countries in this crisis? The question on Russian drivers is from Horst Klauser, which is, would Russia react in the same aggressive way if it were not for NATO, but for joining the EU? And on Ukraine's establishment, the questions are a little more detailed. One is about, whether you see, the Zelensky and his supporters reacting in a different way to this crisis than they did to the crisis that played out last spring, also with Russian troop movements, in terms of using it to push for greater support for NATO membership. And then there's a question from Eli Cowell about how the Ukrainian security services, the SBU, the MBS, are addressing counterintelligence threats posed by Russian escalation. And actually the previous question was from Natalia Sevelyova again. So let's just go again in the order that we started, and again request that people take no more than 2 minutes for their final remarks. So Volodymyr Dubovyk.
Right. That'll be hard, but okay. Actually, we've seen a tremendous amount of unity of the West. We were surprised through that week when Russians were meeting first with Americans in Geneva, and then Brussels, NATO, and the EU came up with a very strong position. The 30 members of NATO, just one position, critical of Russia, supporting of Ukraine. That's a big deal. I mean, of course, that could change if Russia indeed moves in with some invasion that could actually break a little bit the West. But what we've seen so far is really interesting, and there are so many other initiatives. I hope that would not undermine the unified, coherent position of the West. But there are, for instance, the Weimar Triangle is awakened. Then Poland is speaking to Great Britain, and then Macron is going to apparently to Ukraine and Russia, and then Scholz coming to Washington. So there are so many things going on. Apparently, everyone in the West is kind of awakened to this necessity to stop Russia and help Ukraine. And that might produce some disunity and some little different plans that will be competing between each other. But so far, Ukrainians are really pleased to see that we are not thrown under the bus, that West actually is ready to stand strong for us.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Serhiy.
Yes, very briefly, on the question of Ukrainian power ministries, unfortunately, the SBU and the Interior Minister have very little credibility in Ukraine. SBU, specifically the security service, is led by a very close associate of Mr. Zelensky, who has been implicated in a number of scandals and corruption scandals as well. It has no political, it has no independence from political interference. It is viewed as basically a lever of political control that Zelensky uses in order to target his political opponents. There has been very serious criticisms of Zelensky administration for resisting the calls of the Western governments to actually reform the security service. There has been no reform of the security service attempted under the presidency of Volodymyr Zelensky. A number of plots that have been revealed by Zelensky. Some of them actually just raise a lot of eyebrows because they do not seem very credible. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the Ukrainian security services are prepared to seriously tackle the possible subversion efforts by the Russian agents. I also have to remind you that the Zelensky administration was seriously damaged by the revelations from Bellingcat regarding the failure of the operation to capture some of the pro-Russian agents who were traveling from, who were supposed to travel from Minsk to Turkey, and they were supposed to be captured by the Ukrainian, and supposedly somebody leaked this information, and so Bellingcat revealed that some of this leakage might have come from within Zelensky's circles. Finally, I don't want to make a big point out of it, but I want to show through the share of screen option the democracy scores for Ukraine for the Freedom House. As you can see, Olexiy, democracy score for Ukraine was never below 4 points in the period after the Orange Revolution. It stagnated during the Yushchenko presidency, and it deteriorated under the Yanukovych presidency. And currently, Ukraine is ranked as a partly free country by the Freedom House. So it never really reached the status of a fully democratic state. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll turn to Tetyana, and actually we have one more question come in that's directed at you, so let me just pose it, which is from Mikhail Filipov, who asks whether you could imagine a federal model, constitutional, for Ukraine that could make Donbass willing to stay within Ukraine, as in Ukrainian Federation.
Thank you. I exactly wanted to pick this question. I believe that autonomy status for Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast could be a conflict prevention mechanism in the short period between the end of Euromaidan revolution and the start of Girkin invasion, when local elite in Donetsk and Lugansk were powerful, and when they bargaining with the new government in Kyiv about their power in Donetsk. But now the federalization, it's absolutely lost question. I cannot imagine any situation when Ukrainian society and local people in Donetsk and Lugansk and in Ukraine controlled Donbass could agree for such option. So please to show us, we could say in Russian, that's not an issue now. By the way, I could recommend you to read my article for blog 50 Shades of Federalism, where this idea was explained in detail.
Okay, thank you very much, Tetyana. So next is Olexiy Haran. Maybe unmute.
Yeah. I'm following the discussion with such a pleasure. The idea of federalization never had support of Ukrainians, maybe very, very close period after 1991. After that, yes, people were in favor of more decentralization. That's true. So people supported more decentralization, but not federalization. So if regarding, sorry. I'm sorry, I lost my mind thinking about the polls. Okay, so now regarding Freedom House, Sergiy, there are famous and very simplified maps of freedom in the world. Green, three colors, green, yellow, and I believe blue. So after, you may see it and you may find it from on the web. So in 2005, yes, Ukraine was recognized as a free country, but then, yes, we are coming to, there are problems. By the way, I think that the progress Ukraine has made after Euromaidan is not adequately assessed by part of Ukrainian intellectuals and also experts who are going to criticize the problems, and we have a lot of problems, as you know, but still we are free. We are making elections, and the vote of the people do matter. Finally, regarding the question, what would be Russian reaction to idea to the process of joining the EU? Let me remind you what happened in 2013. Ukrainians simply wanted to have a free trade zone with the free trade zone. We had free trade zone with Russia and the CIS. We wanted free trade zone with the EU. And what was Putin's reaction? Reaction of Putin was, no, you should join the customs union. So basically, any move of Ukrainians to become more independent is faced by Putin's brutal attacks, unfortunately. It's for rational view, but it's also about some irrational views in his mind, which were mentioned in his, by my colleagues. And for Putin, Ukrainian democracy is a threat. Ukrainian democracy and effectiveness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And the last 2 minutes are for Oksana.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Yeah, I think like the question that Oleksiy was just answering, I wanted to basically remind the person who asked the question exactly the same thing. So when in 2013, like the origins of the current crisis, when Yanukovych begins to negotiate association and free trade agreement, right? And we see first the trade war already in the fall of 2013, and then of course, you know, the consequences after that. So to me, it sort of raises the question, right? Like, I mean, I think it is definitely the crisis for Putin is more than just about Ukraine, and when it comes to Ukraine, it's more than just about NATO. I think absolutely I would agree with this, and that, I mean, to me raises the question, kind of what would satisfy Putin? Like, what options like do we have moving forward? And unfortunately, they're not great. I mean, the way I see it, I think there are two possibilities, kind of the bad and the terrible one. The terrible one, of course, would be that Putin decides to invade, right, and try to accomplish his goal of reestablishing the sphere of influence by force, right? And the bad, I mean, maybe less terrible, is that we would see continuation of what we see now, right? We may see the sort of ebb and flow. I don't know for how long. That goes back to, you know, the spring. There was amassing of the troops. Then there were de-escalation. Now we again see sort of amassing. I think they do have a way out of it because they keep saying how it's just military training and we're not preparing to attack. So I don't think the invasion is predetermined, right? So maybe I'll end with that. Henry, like there was this question about Zelensky reacting differently. I don't think I caught it quite. Maybe, sorry if somebody maybe else wants to answer it.
Yeah, just there was one last question about whether Zelensky has reacted differently to this crisis than the one last spring. If we have any takers, we can have 30 seconds on this. Otherwise, we should wrap up. All right. Well, maybe at this point, we should just go ahead and wrap up. Thank you.
Well, I think maybe here I just would add that we see this crisis is somehow different because the level of hysteria raised by Putin is really, really high, you know, and we don't know what he may do, what would happen next. Because in spring, for me, it was understandable that I think the idea for Putin was to blackmail the West and then to retreat and push Nord Stream 2. For me, it was part of the game. Now, really, I don't understand what Putin wants, what he wants to get, and how realistic he is, besides the fact that he is going to crush Ukrainian democracy.
Okay, well, on that sad note, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Again, thank you to each of our speakers for a fascinating discussion. And we invite each of you, if you're interested, to take a look at the website, ponarseurasia.org. I just circulated the link in case you would like more analysis, including references to some of the policy memos and other writings that each of our scholars has presented over the years on these topics. Thank you again to Ponars Eurasia, George Washington University, and again to everybody who attended today. for this event. We look forward to seeing you at other events. Thank you very much.
Thank you for great moderation. Applause.
Thank you, everybody.
Lots of honors.
Yeah. To Henry, yes, and to honors. Thank you all.
And to future offline conferences.